The noon sun over Fresno burned without mercy, turning the soil into dust and the air into a furnace. Robert Miller stood by his silent John Deere tractor, a $500,000 giant that refused to breathe. Sweat traced lines down his weathered face as he kicked the dry earth, wondering how many days of planting he was about to lose. In the distance, cicadas buzzed, as if mocking his despair. Each hour meant less harvest, more debt. He thought of his father's old oxen, of simpler times, when stubbornness and muscle could move the land. Now, all his hope rested on a machine that had betrayed him, and yet fate was about to send him help from where he least expected. If this story touches you, stay with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. The land stretched wide and dry, a patchwork of fields waiting for seed. Fresno's horizon shimmered in the heat, where the blue of the sky met the ochre soil. Robert Miller, Bob to everyone in town, leaned against the wooden fence that marked the edge of his property. At 60, his frame was still strong, but time had carved deep lines around his eyes, reminders of seasons spent fighting sun, wind, and debt. The John Deere tractor stood a few yards away, its green frame bright against the pale dust. It looked imposing, powerful, a symbol of modern farming, the kind of machine Bob's father, Henry, would never have believed possible. But the machine was silent. It had coughed and shuddered for days, losing strength until, finally, it gave up. Now it was nothing more than a hulking statue in the middle of the field. Bob removed his cap, ran a hand over thinning grey hair, and sighed. He thought of his father's old oxen pulling wooden ploughs through stubborn soil. Those days had been slower, harder, but somehow simpler. Henry had worked 40 years with nothing more than sweat and rope, and still the family had food on the table. Bob had wanted more, for his wife, for his son, for the farm itself. That's why he signed the papers at the bank, borrowing enough to buy a $500,000 tractor. "It'll pay for itself in 5 years," the salesman had said. But now, staring at the lifeless giant, Bob wondered if he had been sold more than just a machine. Maybe he'd bought himself 10 years of chains. The tractor's failure wasn't sudden. At first, the engine made a sound like a cough, sharp and uneven. Then, as if it had grown tired, it lost power, slowing to a crawl. Yesterday, when Bob tried to start it, smoke rose from beneath the hood, white and bitter, with a sharp smell of burned wires. He had kicked the tire in anger, then stood there, chest heaving, staring at the thing as if it were mocking him. His wife, Linda, came out of the house carrying a glass of water, her brow furrowed. "Still no luck?" she asked, handing him the glass. Bob shook his head, dead as a stone. She watched him take a sip. "Call Thomas," she suggested softly. The name landed heavy. Thomas Reed was the only tractor mechanic within 50 miles, a man with decades of reputation. But his services came with a price, always high, always painful. Bob clenched his jaw. "I don't know if I can afford Thomas right now," he muttered. Linda placed a hand on his arm. "Can you afford not to?" Bob looked out at the field, at the dry soil waiting for seed. Each day lost meant less harvest, less money, more debt. His stomach tightened as if ropes were coiling around him. He remembered the bank officer's words, clear as if they were whispered that very morning. 10 years. Monthly payments. Don't fall behind. That night, Bob sat at the kitchen table with the bills spread before him. Linda sewed quietly in the corner, and the ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. His son, Miguel, only 14, came in with a baseball glove under his arm. "Dad, you coming to practice tomorrow?" Bob lifted his eyes, forcing a smile. "I'll try, kiddo. Tractor's giving me trouble." Miguel frowned. "Again? Thought it was new." Bob's smile faded. "New doesn't always mean strong." Miguel hesitated, then shrugged, too young to understand the weight that pressed on his father's shoulders. He disappeared into his room, leaving Bob staring at the bills again. The following morning, Thomas arrived in his old Ford truck, the name Reed's Tractor Service painted in fading letters on the door. He climbed out, tall and wiry, with silver hair slicked back and hands rough from years of work. His toolbox clanked as he set it down by the tractor. "So, this the beast?" Thomas said, wiping his brow. Bob nodded. "Won't start. Smoke yesterday smelled like burned wiring." Thomas circled the machine like a doctor inspecting a patient. He tapped here, pulled there, muttered under his breath. Finally, he straightened up. "Electronic fuel injection system," he said. "Needs a full diagnostic at my shop. I'll have to bring the computer in. Won't be cheap." Bob's heart sank. "How much?" "Diagnostic alone, 1,200. Repair, 8 to 10,000, maybe more, depends on parts. These machines are fancy, imported components, can't do much without them." Bob's mouth went dry. 8 to 10,000. More than 3 months of payments. He rubbed his temples, fighting the urge to curse. Thomas shrugged. "I'll bring the tow truck tomorrow. Nothing more I can do here." When the truck disappeared down the road, Bob stood alone by the tractor again. The sun was high, burning his skin, and the machine remained silent. He pressed a fist against the hood, leaning his forehead there, whispering a prayer that sounded more like desperation. "God, give me a sign. Something, anything." From a distance came the faint hum of an engine, smaller, lighter, faster than a truck. A motorcycle. Dust lifted along the dirt road as it approached, carrying with it the promise of something unexpected. Bob squinted against the sun, watching the figure ride closer. Whoever it was, they weren't Thomas Reed, and they weren't part of the bankers who hounded him. The bike slowed, and for the first time in days, a flicker of curiosity sparked in Bob's chest. He had asked for a sign. Maybe, just maybe, it was arriving now. The motorcycle came to a stop in a cloud of dust. Bob shaded his eyes with one hand, squinting at the rider who dismounted with swift, confident movements. The helmet came off, and to his surprise, a young woman shook loose strands of brown hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She was no more than 26, her cheeks flushed from the heat, her denim coveralls streaked with oil stains that spoke louder than any introduction. She set down a small metal toolbox, its hinges gleaming, every tool inside arranged with careful order. Nothing fancy, no expensive machines, just a collection of screwdrivers, wrenches, and a digital multimeter that looked well-loved, but far from new. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, brushing dust off her gloves. Her voice carried a calm steadiness, practiced from years of being doubted. Bob hesitated. "Yes, and you are?" "Emily Carter. My aunt runs the hardware store in town. She told me you were in a bind." She gestured toward the silent tractor. "Mind if I take a look?" Bob blinked. He had been expecting another grizzled mechanic, someone like Thomas, not a young woman on a bike with a toolbox. He crossed his arms, skepticism tightening his shoulders. "This machine's worth $500,000. It's not a lawnmower. You really think you can handle it?" Emily didn't flinch. "Engines don't care about your doubts, Mr. Miller. They care about fuel, air, and spark. If one's missing, the whole thing falls apart. Let me try. If I can't fix it, you don't owe me a cent." The firmness in her tone unsettled him. He looked at the tractor, at the field stretching wide and hungry for seed. What choice did he have? With a weary sigh, he nodded. "All right. Show me what you've got." Emily smiled faintly, then knelt by the machine as if greeting an old friend. She placed her tools on a clean cloth spread over the dry ground. Every motion was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Bob found himself watching, not just curious, but unwillingly impressed by the care she showed. "Tell me what happened," she asked, peering under the hood. Bob described the coughs, the loss of power, the smoke, the smell of burned wires. Emily listened, her brow furrowed. nodding as though she was piecing together a puzzle in her head. She connected a small diagnostic device to the tractor's port, the screen glowing faintly. Numbers and codes flashed, and she studied them with quiet intensity. "It's not the fuel injection system," she said finally. "That's the expensive guess Thomas Reed probably gave you, right?" Bob stiffened. "How do you know?" "Because they always blame the injection system first," Emily replied. "Truth is, it's almost always wiring. See here." She pointed to a section of the harness where the insulation was blackened, the connector brittle. "Heat and dust corrode faster than people think. One bad wire can bring down the whole beast." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Parts will cost maybe $120. 2 hours of work. If I'm wrong, I'll pack up and you don't pay." Bob let out a bitter laugh, not at her, but at the cruel contrast. "Thomas quoted me thousands. Thousands. And you're telling me it's just a wire?" Emily straightened, wiping her hands. "Knowledge is worth more than tools, Mr. Miller. Fancy computers don't fix machines. People do." He studied her face, the confidence there, the steadiness of her gaze. She reminded him of his younger self, back when he believed stubbornness could conquer the world. For a moment, hope flickered where despair had camped for days. "Do it," he said. Emily set to work with the precision of a surgeon. She clipped away damaged wire, replaced connectors, sealed them with careful patience. Sweat dripped down her forehead, yet she moved without rush, explaining each step as if teaching a class. "Machines are like people," she said, tightening a bolt. "One clogged artery, one broken nerve, and the whole body suffers. Fix the connection, restore the flow, and everything comes alive again." Bob listened in silence, drawn in by her words. It wasn't just the repair, it was the philosophy behind it, the respect she held for the machine. He thought of Henry, his father, who had treated oxen with the same reverence as living beings that carried the farm on their backs. Maybe Emily belonged to that rare breed who saw more than metal. By the time she reconnected the last wire, the sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the field. Emily stood, wiping her hands on a rag. "Moment of truth," she said, climbing into the tractor seat. Bob's heart pounded as she turned the key. For a breath, there was silence. Then, with a deep rumble, the engine roared to life, steady and strong, its power vibrating through the ground. Bob's mouth fell open. The sound was like water in a desert, like hope made tangible. He removed his cap, pressing it against his chest. Emily jumped down, grinning faintly. "Looks like your harvest is safe." Bob stared at her, struggling for words. "Miss Carter, you just saved me more than money. You saved my farm." She shrugged lightly, packing her tools. "I didn't save it. You did, when you chose not to give up." But Bob knew better. The girl with the motorcycle and the small toolbox had done more than fix a machine. She had reminded him that miracles sometimes arrived disguised as ordinary people. The sound of the tractor still echoed in Bob's mind long after Emily had left. He had stood by the machine for nearly an hour, listening to the steady rhythm of the engine as if it were proof that hope had returned to his land. By the next morning, half the valley knew the story. Word traveled faster than the irrigation canals that cut through the fields. Farmers greeted him with curious looks at the feed store, asking, "Is it true a young woman fixed that $500,000 John Deere with a handful of tools?" Bob only nodded, still half in disbelief himself. "She saved my crop," he said simply, and that was enough. 2 days later, as he guided the tractor across the fields, his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant, he answered. "Mr. Miller?" A voice carried the rasp of age and long days in the sun. "This is George Anderson from the North Ranch. I heard about what happened with your tractor. My combine's been down for 2 weeks. They're telling me it needs a whole new hydraulic system. 25 grand. I can't swing that. Do you think that girl—" Emily, was it? "Do you think she'd take a look?" Bob didn't hesitate. "I'll ask her. She's the real deal, George. That afternoon, Emily returned. Same motorcycle, same modest box of tools. She stood by George's silent case combine, her eyes scanning the giant machine like a doctor sizing up a patient in critical condition. The Anderson ranchers stood in a loose circle, arms folded, skepticism etched on every face. "You sure about this?" one of them muttered to George. "She's just a kid." George raised a hand. "Let her work. Miller swears by her." Emily crouched by the machine, running her fingers along hoses, wiping grime off fittings, unscrewing a valve with careful precision. She drew a small container of oil and tilted it into the light. The liquid was dark, thick, almost sludgy. She sniffed it, wrinkled her nose. "There's your problem," she said calmly. "Your hydraulic oil is old, full of sediment. It's clogged the valves, choking the system. Like cholesterol in arteries. You don't need a new hydraulic system. You need this one cleaned and rebuilt." George blinked. "That's simple." Emily smirked faintly. "Simple isn't the same as easy. It'll take hours of work, but you won't be paying 25 grand. She laid out her tools on a clean rag. Wrenches gleamed in the afternoon sun, each placed with care. The ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances. No laptop, no diagnostic station, no expensive equipment, just discipline, order, and a woman who looked far too young to be commanding such confidence. Bob stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the scene with pride swelling in his chest. He had been them once, skeptical, dismissive. Now he knew better. Emily removed the valves one by one, scrubbing them with solvent, blowing compressed air to clear every trace of sludge. She replaced seals and filters with practiced ease, her hands steady, her expression focused. Hours passed, the sun dipped lower, and the workers who had scoffed at her were now silent, watching every move as if they were in a classroom. Finally, she reassembled the system, wiped her hands, and motioned for George. "Start it." The old farmer climbed into the combine, turned the key, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, with a low groan, the machine came alive. Hydraulic arms lifted smoothly, gears turned, and the combine rumbled with strength it hadn't shown in weeks. George laughed, a booming sound that echoed across the ranch. He jumped down, clapping Emily on the shoulder so hard she nearly stumbled. "Girl, you just saved my harvest. I owe you more than money." Emily shook her head, smiling modestly. "Pay me fair, and tell your neighbors I'm honest. That's all I ask." And so the word spread further. In Fresno, Bakersfield, even as far as Visalia, farmers began whispering about the young woman mechanic who fixed what others declared impossible. She became more than a curiosity. She became hope. One evening, as Emily packed her tools after another repair, her phone rang. She almost ignored it. Calls rarely brought good news. But curiosity won. "Miss Carter?" The voice was smooth, professional. "My name is Michael Johnson. I'm the Regional Director of Agritech Solutions. We've heard about your work. Impressive, truly. We'd like to discuss an opportunity with you." Emily frowned, holding the phone tighter. "What kind of opportunity?" "A leadership position, supervisor of technical operations, salary in the six figures, full benefits, a team under your direction. You'd be working with the latest diagnostic technology, traveling between farms, overseeing large-scale projects, a future as stable as the company itself." She glanced at her modest toolbox, at the grease on her coveralls, at the motorcycle waiting by the dirt road. A life of security beckoned from the other end of the line. A chance to escape the dust, the long hours, the skepticism that dogged her every step. "I appreciate the offer," she said slowly. "Can I have some time to think?" "Of course," Michael replied. "Opportunities like this don't come often. Don't take too long." The call ended, but the wait remained. Emily sat on the edge of her motorcycle, staring out at the fading light over the fields. Her heart beat with conflicting rhythms, one of ambition, another of belonging. She thought of Bob's gratitude, George's laughter, the relief on farmers' faces when machines roared back to life under her hands. Could she trade that for a corporate badge and a paycheck? As the sky turned crimson, Emily whispered to herself, as if testing the words, "Who am I fixing machines for? Them or me?" The next morning, the fields woke under a pale band of gold, and the air, for once, felt cool enough to breathe. Emily arrived at Bob's place before the heat could harden the dirt. She didn't come to fix anything, nothing was broken, but to return a socket she'd borrowed and to ride the tractor a few minutes, listening, confirming. Bob found her there, palm resting on the fender as if checking a pulse. "Purrs like a barn cat," she said. Bob smiled, lines softening. "Haven't slept this easy in months." From the porch, Linda waved them in for coffee. Inside, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and dust and something warm that didn't come from the oven. On the table stood a tin of oatmeal cookies, already missing half its soldiers. "You saved our planting window," Linda said, placing a mug in front of Emily. "I thought you might like a proper thank you that isn't a grease rag." Emily laughed, shy and grateful. She didn't mention the call from Agritech, not yet. Miguel burst in, hair still wet from the hose, baseball cap backward. "Can I see the multimeter again?" he asked, already reaching. Emily handed it over like a teacher who trusts a careful student. "Voltage first," she said. "You measure life before you move it." He nodded, chin serious, the way boys do when they're practicing being men. They were interrupted by the crunch of tires on gravel. A powder blue pickup rolled to a stop out front. Thomas Reed stepped out, hat low, jaw tight. He carried an old mechanic's dignity, creased shirt, clean boots, a toolbox that had seen more seasons than most marriages. "Morning," he said, gaze flicking from Bob to Emily. "Heard your tractor's running." "It is," Bob answered, cautiously polite. Thomas set his toolbox down but didn't open it. Words moving fast. "Folks say the girl on a motorcycle fixed what the old man couldn't." No one spoke. A fly buzzed at the screen door. Thomas's mouth twitched into something that was almost a smile but wasn't. "I've been the only tractor man within 50 miles for 20 years. When you're the only bridge, people blame you for the toll." Emily held his eyes. "You quoted an injection system replacement." "It wasn't that." He nodded once, accepting the hit. "I gave the safe answer for a field call. Shop time, scoped harness, then parts. Expensive, yeah, but I've been burned by cheap guesses. Farmers don't forget the one time you're wrong." "Knowledge isn't a guess," Emily said quietly. "Maybe not for you," he replied, voice gentler than his words. "You still got quick hands. Mine learned to be careful." Silence softened into something human. Thomas ran a thumb along the pickup's doorseam. "Didn't come to fight. Came to say, good work." He tipped his hat to Bob, then to Emily, and drove away with the slow humility of a man making room for the future. After he left, Linda exhaled. "Pride's a heavy tool," she murmured. Emily stared at the road long after the dust had settled. The world made room for skill, but it didn't always know how to say so without bruising someone else. By afternoon, the valley heat returned like a hand on the back of the neck. Emily rode into town to her aunt's hardware store, a narrow place lined with pegboards and patient advice. Bells tinkled at the door. Behind the counter, Aunt Carol looked up from an order sheet and grinned. "Hero of the week," she said. "You planning to eat or just live on engine fumes?" Emily stole a grape soda from the fridge and leaned back against the paint mixer, the can hissing open like relief. "Aunt Carol, Agritech called. That the suit who sells computers with wrenches attached? Regional director, supervisor job, 6 figures, the kind of stability that shows up in brochures." Carol's grin faded into something proud and careful. "And what does your gut say? Not your bank account, your gut." Emily looked at her hands, at the thin scars where metal had argued, and she'd learned to answer. My gut says I like fixing what matters to people who don't have a backup machine. My head says I could send Mom money every month and not worry about the rent ever again. Carol folded her arms. Two truths can sit in the same chair until you ask them to stand. The store door chimed again. George Anderson stepped in, hat in hand, wife at his elbow, both wearing that farmer's Sunday face, dressed plain but straight. They didn't come for bolts. Miss Carter, George said, we've got a few folks out front who wanted a word. Emily followed them to the sidewalk. A handful of neighbors had gathered, faces she'd seen at fields and feed stores, a man with sun-cracked knuckles, a woman with a baby balanced on one hip, a teen with dust on his sneakers and hope in his eyes. They felt awkward blocking foot traffic, but nobody moved. A woman stepped forward first. I'm Marie, she said. I milk. 3 kids. My pump died last winter and the service company charged me for a whole new unit. We maxed the card and it still whistles wrong. If you stay, you'll be the one we call before we sell the kitchen table. A hum of agreement. The teen found his voice. If you opened a shop, I'd come sweep floors. Learn stuff. No one teaches here, they just invoice. George cleared his throat. You fixed what 25 grand wouldn't. Don't know what Agritech pays, but I know what you're worth. Around here, that's not a number, it's a neighbor. Emily felt the words land, each one tapping the exact place the company's offer couldn't reach. That evening, Bob and Linda hosted a small cookout. A few families, paper plates, the kind of potato salad that travels by Tupperware gossip. The tractor idled once like a satisfied guest before Bob killed the engine. They ate under a string of yellow bulbs that made the dusk look kind. Stories grew legs. The year the wells ran low, the storm that knocked out power during harvest, the calf that would not live, and then did. Laughter traveled, gentle and grateful. When the plates were mostly bones and crumbs, conversation turned. Linda's eyes found Emily's. What will you do? Before Emily could answer, her phone buzzed. Michael Johnson. She stared at the name like a locked door. Take it, Bob said. We'll be right here. She walked a few steps toward the fence, the cord of lights pooling gold at her boots. Hello? Miss Carter, Michael's voice carried charm, neatly pressed. Hoping to catch you before week's end. The position is open now. We'd like an answer within 48 hours. 48. Transitions require clarity, he said. We offer training, relocation support if needed, a sign-on bonus. You'll make more impact with scale. Hundreds of farms touched by your leadership. She glanced back at the table. Linda pouring lemonade for the baby's mother. George teaching Miguel a knot. Bob laughing at something small and unimportant enough to mean everything. The word scale felt like a ruler someone else held. I appreciate the offer, Emily said. I'll call you tomorrow. She ended the call and stayed at the fence a beat longer, letting the sound of crickets and faint radio music settle the air back into itself. Miguel wandered over, hands stuffed in pockets. If you go, he said, eyes on his shoes, will you still show me how to use the meter? Emily smiled. I'll show you now. Tomorrow's greedy. They spent 20 minutes by lantern glow testing a spare battery, reading numbers like secret codes. Miguel's concentration tightened into something bright. When they joined the table again, Aunt Carol had arrived, late shift done, apron still powdered with sawdust. Your face says heavy weather, Carol observed, sliding Emily a cookie. 48 hours, Emily said. Carol looked toward the fields, where darkness had swallowed the neat lines of hope. When your dad taught me to fix leaky pipes, he said 2 things. First, water goes where it's invited. Second, if you fix the wrong joint, the right one bursts later. Careers are like that. Linda placed a hand over Emily's. We can't choose for you, but I'll say this. Every time you left a place better than you found it, you were already rich. Bob cleared his throat. He wasn't the speech type, but the valley had taught him to talk when it counted. I took a big loan, because a salesman told me that's how you keep up. Maybe he was half right, but the thing that saved this farm wasn't a bigger payment. It was you. If you stay, we'll have your back. If you go, we'll clap anyway. But I think this land remembers the hands that help it breathe. The words were simple. They did not push. They did not plead. They sat on the table like one more dish. Take what you need. Much later, after good nights and dishwashing and the ritual hunt for missing Tupperware lids, Emily wheeled her motorcycle toward the road. Bob walked with her to the gate. "You don't owe us your life," he said. "But if you're measuring, measure this too. My son asked about voltage tonight instead of video games." Emily laughed softly. It sounded like relief, finding a chair. "That's a dangerous start," she said. "He'll be better than me by spring." She pulled on her helmet. The engine barked once, then settled into a steady thrum. Before lowering the visor, she looked past Bob to the dark fields, the faint outline of the John Deere, patient as a moonlit horse. 48 hours, she repeated, but the words no longer felt like a countdown. They felt like a choice, making room for the person who would make it. She rode away under a sky thick with stars, the road a narrow ribbon between orchards. At the bend, near the irrigation canal, she eased off the throttle and coasted. Wind pressed against her jacket. The phone in her pocket lay quiet. Tomorrow she would call Michael. Tomorrow she would draw a map on the back of an envelope. Income, rent, mom, tools she needed, names of kids who wanted to learn, hours she could charge and still sleep. Tomorrow she would visit a vacant unit, 2 blocks from Aunt Carol's store, the one with the roll-up door and good light. She would measure. She would invite the future to go where it was needed most. Tonight, she let the bike carry her home, not away. The morning after the cookout, Emily woke restless. The valley air carried that stillness before heat swallows the day. Yet her mind churned like a motor refusing to idle. 48 hours. That number hung in her head like a countdown clock she hadn't asked for. She rode into town early, the motorcycle's hum keeping her thoughts from spilling over. Past the water tower and the row of citrus groves, she slowed near Main Street. A small brick building sat between an empty laundromat and a feed supply outlet. Its roll-up door was half rust, half promise. Dust filmed the windows, but the bones were solid. Concrete floor, high ceiling, plenty of light. She parked, helmet under her arm, and peered through the glass. She imagined benches lined with tools, shelves with labeled bins, a whiteboard with diagrams drawn in grease pencil. More than a shop, maybe a school. Thinking of buying. The voice startled her. Aunt Carol had appeared, apron still smudged with sawdust from the store. She leaned on the doorway like someone who'd been waiting. Emily grinned weakly. "Renting, maybe. If I stay." Carol followed her gaze through the window. "Good bones," she said. "Place just needs someone who believes walls can hold more than silence." Emily let the words settle. For a moment, the shop wasn't empty. It was full of young hands learning, of farmers leaning on counters, of engines reborn. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but answered with a clipped, cautious hello. "Miss Carter, my name's Henry Lopez. I live out past Riverbend. My baler broke down yesterday. Company told me to replace the whole unit, 15 grand. My wife said I should call you. Could you maybe look at it?" Emily glanced at Carol, who raised her eyebrows knowingly. "I'll be there in an hour," Emily said. The Riverbend farm was smaller than Miller's or Anderson's, fields patchy, equipment older, everything held together by equal parts faith and duct tape. Henry, in his 50s, met her at the gate. His hands were raw, his shoulders slumped. Behind him, a little girl clung shyly to his overalls. "This is the baler," he said, leading her to a sun-baked shed. The machine stood crooked, its belts loose, paint faded. Emily ran her hand over the frame. She crouched, listened as Henry described the sound it had made before dying. "Like a cough," he said, then a crack. After that, nothing. Emily opened a side panel, found the culprit within minutes, a worn bearing and a misaligned belt. Nothing catastrophic, nothing near 15 grand. You don't need a new unit, she told him. Just a bearing and some patience. Henry blinked, relief already softening his face. Can it be fixed today? She nodded. If you've got coffee and a rag, yes. The little girl giggled as Emily spread her tools on a clean cloth, the ritual that steadied her hands and her heart. She explained each step aloud, not for Henry's sake, but for the girl's curious eyes. Machines are like stories, she said softly. Every noise tells you what's wrong if you listen close enough. 2 hours later, the baler's belt spun again, smooth and ready. Henry shook her hand with both of his, eyes bright. You just saved our season. I was ready to sell the pickup to pay for that replacement. Emily only smiled, but inside something shifted. Agritech would never come here. They'd never drink bitter coffee in a crooked shed or kneel in dust to explain bearings to a child. This was work that mattered. That evening she returned to Carol's store. Bob and Linda were there, talking quietly with Carol by the counter. They turned as Emily entered, dirt on her coveralls, sweat damp at her hairline. You look like you wrestled the valley, Bob said with a grin. Only a baler, Emily answered, dropping onto a stool. She recounted Henry's story, the simple fix, the relief in his eyes. Linda shook her head. And Agritech wanted you in glass offices, solving problems on paper. Carol leaned forward, hands folded. Stability sounds sweet until you taste it. Then you realize it's just sugar water. Purpose is bread. It keeps you alive. Bob added, quieter now. What you did for me, for George, for Henry, that doesn't show up on company spreadsheets, but it shows up in harvests, in families, in kids like Miguel who believe they can learn. The words pressed deeper than any corporate promise. Emily thought again of the brick building, the light through dusty windows, the phantom classroom she'd pictured. Her phone buzzed once more, Michael Johnson's name on the screen. She let it ring until silence returned. Tomorrow, she said firmly. I'll answer tomorrow. Carol smiled. Tomorrow's when bread rises. Emily looked at them all, Bob, Linda, Carol, and realized her choice was already bending into shape. It wasn't about money or even reputation. It was about the kind of mechanic she wanted to be, the kind whose work lived on in more than machines. The drive to Fresno's corporate district felt longer than it was. Emily borrowed her aunt's pickup. Her motorcycle seemed too small for the weight of the decision she carried. The closer she got to the Agritech headquarters, the more the valley's dust gave way to glass and steel. Office buildings rose like monuments, their mirrored windows reflecting sunlight back into the sky. The Agritech tower stood at the end of a boulevard lined with manicured palms. The company logo, a gear wrapped around a stalk of wheat, shone from a polished sign near the entrance. Emily parked in the visitor lot, wiping her palms against her jeans before stepping inside. The lobby was cool, almost cold, the air conditioning biting after weeks in the fields. Floors gleamed, voices echoed faintly, and the smell was sterile. No grease, no soil, just the faint tang of disinfectant. A receptionist with a flawless smile handed her a badge. Mr. Johnson will meet you upstairs, she said. Emily followed the quiet hum of the elevator to the 10th floor. Glass walls revealed meeting rooms filled with charts, laptops, and men in suits. She caught glimpses of diagrams, tractors reduced to data points, fields mapped in squares of color-coded yield. Machines were no longer engines to be listened to. They were numbers to be optimized. Michael Johnson greeted her at the end of a corridor. Tall, clean-shaven, with a tailored jacket, he shook her hand firmly. His office overlooked the valley, the fields stretching green and gold in perfect rows below. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "I'm glad you came." Emily nodded, taking in the view. "It's different up here." "Perspective changes everything," he replied, motioning for her to sit. "We've heard remarkable things. Fixing machines in the field with little more than a toolbox. That's talent. We'd like to harness that talent on a bigger scale. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were charts, salary figures, benefits packages. Numbers so large they seemed like a foreign language compared to the few $100s she had charged Henry Lopez. You'd lead a regional team, Michael continued. Latest diagnostic tools, real-time data, international projects. Stability, growth, the chance to shape agriculture far beyond Fresno. Emily traced a finger along the neat rows of figures. Stability, growth, 6 figures in black ink. She imagined her mother's relief, her father's grudging pride, the comfort of never counting bills at the end of the month. But then she thought of Bob's gratitude, George's booming laugh when his combine roared back to life, Henry's daughter watching wide-eyed as the baler spun again. None of them were in these charts. None of them would ever see this office. Michael studied her silence. "You're hesitating," he said softly. "I understand. You've built trust out there. But consider this. In 5 years, you could be directing hundreds of mechanics. In 10, you could be vice president. Isn't that more powerful than fixing one machine at a time?" Emily met his gaze. Powerful for who? The farmers or the shareholders? Michael didn't flinch. For both. Without scale, there's no sustainability. The word echoed in her chest. Scale. She had heard it before, at the cookout, but in a different tone. Out there, scale was rows of crops, seasons measured by rain and sweat. Here, scale was profit margins and market expansion. She closed the folder, pushing it back across the desk. Machines don't break on schedules. They don't wait for quarterly reports. They fail in the middle of harvest, in the heat, when someone's entire year hangs on a single belt or wire. You can't fix that with charts. Michael leaned back, studying her with a mixture of disappointment and respect. "You'd rather get your hands dirty in the dust?" Emily smiled faintly. "That's where the work is. That's where the people are." The conversation ended politely. Michael shook her hand again, his grip firmer this time, almost as if to hold on to the possibility she might reconsider. "You have 24 hours, he said. "Think carefully." Outside, the sun hit her like a wall. She pulled off her jacket, feeling the valley's familiar heat return to her skin. The glass towers shrank in her rearview mirror as she drove back toward the farmland. At the edge of town, she passed Bob's fields. His tractor was moving steady rows across the soil, the engine purring. She slowed the truck, rolling down the window. Bob waved from the cab, and Miguel waved too, holding a multimeter proudly like a trophy. Emily laughed, the sound carried away by the wind. That sight, a boy learning to measure voltage in the dust, was worth more than any figure on Michael's paper. When she reached her small apartment, she set her tools on the counter one by one. Each bore the mark of use, scratches and dents, the kind of history no corporation could reproduce. She thought of the empty brick building again, the one near Main Street. She could see it clearly now, shelves of tools, young apprentices learning, farmers coming not just for repairs but for explanations, honesty, respect. The phone buzzed once more. Michael Johnson. She let it ring, then placed it face down. In the silence, Emily whispered to herself, "Not scale, roots." And with that word, the decision began to feel less like a burden and more like freedom. Morning light slid through the dusty windows of the brick building on Main Street, turning motes into slow snow. Emily stood in the center of the empty floor with a tape measure, chalk behind her ear, and a notebook balanced on her palm. She marked a line where a bench would go, another where a parts shelf could live. The roll-up door rattled in a mild breeze, like a throat clearing before a speech. A knock. Aunt Carol slipped in, carrying 2 paper cups. "Fuel," she said, handing one over. "I told a few folks you'd be here. A few might have multiplied." Emily glanced toward the sidewalk. Shadows gathered behind the sun-bleached glass. Hats, shoulders, a stroller's handle, a boy's wide eyes. She felt her chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but with the weight of being seen. "Open it," Carol said gently. The door clanked up. Day flooded in, along with 10, then 15 people, sheepish about their own hope. Bob ducked under the door, Miguel at his side. George Anderson followed with his wife. Marie from the dairy squeezed in, the baby asleep on her shoulder. Thomas Reed lingered near the sidewalk, undecided, then stepped inside with the cautious dignity of a man entering a church that wasn't his. "Welcome," Emily said, voice catching on the word. She cleared her throat. "This is, nothing yet, but I can see the something." She walked them through the chalk lines, workbenches here, electrical and diagnostics along that wall, outlets, a whiteboard, a cheap oscilloscope if I can find one that isn't junk, a clean table for valve rebuilds, a pegboard that makes sense, labeled bins. I want this place to teach while it fixes. Miguel raised a hand, even though no one had asked for questions. "Apprenticeship?" he blurted, cheeks flushing. Could there be... could I—" "You'll be the first if your parents say yes," Emily said. He tried to suppress a grin and failed spectacularly. Marie shifted the baby and spoke over the soft hiss of sleep. "What about cost? Folks around here can pay fair, but we can't pay fancy." Emily nodded. "Transparent board by the door, hourly rate posted, parts at cost plus a small margin that I'll write down, not hide. If I quote you a full replacement and it turns out to be a bearing and patience, I'll eat the difference. If I miss something, I fix it. No mystery invoices." A murmur of approval rolled through the room. George scratched his beard. "Training nights?" he asked. "Things like changing hydraulic filters before they choke, what to listen for when a pump starts to whine." "Monthly clinics," Emily said. "Short, practical. Bring your machines, your questions, your stubborn bolts." By the door, Thomas ran a finger along the brick, as if testing the mortar. When he spoke, his voice had the rough kindness of sandpaper that had learned restraint. "You'll need a crimping station," he said. "Heat shrink, adhesive lined. Dust eats connections faster than a salesman eats lunch." "I know," Emily answered, smiling. "Already on the list, but thank you." He met her eyes, then looked away quickly, embarrassed by the truce that had somehow built itself between them. "If you need a loner scan tool," he muttered, "I have one that bites sometimes, but still reads straight." Carol clapped once, like a teacher wrangling a class. "All right, neighbors. If you want this place to exist, let your hands say so. We've got a broom, a shop vac and a radio with only 3 stations." Work began like a tide, slow then everywhere. Bob and George rolled up the door fully and propped it with a 2x4. Miguel swept in long, proud strokes, drawing patterns in the dust before the bristles corrected him. Marie wiped the front glass. Thomas found himself at the wall, tracing circuits in chalk where outlets should go. Emily moved among them, marking measurements, answering questions, laughing when the radio cut from ranchera to static to a preacher who seemed personally invested in talk specs. Between tasks, people handed Emily scraps of themselves. A farmer with shaking hands said his father had taught him to fix a baler with baling wire and stubbornness. He wanted his son to learn more than that. A teen girl asked if apprentices had to be boys. "Especially not," Emily said, handing her the broom. Aunt Carol taped a sheet near the door. Name, phone, the machine that keeps you awake at night. In minutes, the paper filled with careful letters and oil-stained thumbs. Near noon, when the light had shifted from gold to white and the smell of sweat had replaced the ghost of old dust, Emily stepped onto a milk crate. The room quieted on instinct. "I owe you an answer," she said. "Agritech gave me 24 hours. They wanted a supervisor who could touch hundreds of farms through other people's hands." She looked at her palms, nicked and honest. "I want to touch a few farms with my own and teach other hands to do the same." She took a breath that tasted like heat and hope. "I'm staying. I'm opening this shop. We'll start with what we have and grow what we earn. If it fails, it will fail honest. If it works, it will work, because we worked. Silence held for a beat, the kind that marks a boundary between a before and an after. Then the room exhaled. Applause rose, not loud but thick with relief. Bob hugged her, clumsy and brief. Linda wiped her eyes with the corner of her shirt. George thumped her shoulder more carefully this time. Thomas nodded once, as solemn as a notary. Miguel whooped, forgot himself, and whooped again. The phone in Emily's back pocket buzzed. She stepped outside into bleached sunlight, thumb hesitating only a breath before she pressed the call. "Miss Carter," Michael Johnson said, smooth as the lobby's stone. "I trust you've decided." "I have," she answered. "I'm grateful for the offer. I'm declining." A polite pause. "We can revisit in a year. You're talented. You'll want scale." "I do," Emily said, surprising herself with the clarity of it. "But my scale has names." Another pause, longer this time. "Good luck," he said finally, and the line dissolved into dial tone. She slid the phone away and stood for a moment, letting the quiet lay flat again. Inside, the room had become the promise she'd described. Someone had found a bucket and soap. The floor, still cracked and old, showed lighter where the mop passed. Aunt Carol was sketching a parts counter on a paper bag. Thomas had produced a pencil stub from nowhere and was drawing a tidy diagram of a fused distribution block, labeling each circuit in a handwriting that would have made a draftsman weep. Miguel approached, holding a cardboard box. "Found this behind the feed store," he said. Inside were glass jars, clean and waiting. "For bolts," he added, eyes bright. "Perfect," Emily said. She pointed to the pegboard. "Start a system. Washers, clips, leftover fuses. If we can't find it in 30 seconds, it doesn't exist." He nodded like a soldier receiving orders. Late afternoon brought the first test, as if the valley itself wanted to say so be it. A pickup coughed to a stop out front, dragging a small water pump on a trailer. The driver, a woman in her 30s with sunburned cheeks, stepped in, hat clenched. "I heard. Maybe you could look at this. The canal's dropping, and my trees are thirsty." Emily wiped her hands, glanced around at the half-made shop, the chalk lines, the jars labeled in a young hand. "Let's see," she said. They clustered at the trailer. Emily listened, opened a panel, found a cracked impeller housing and a gasket that had been asked to live too many lives. She explained what she saw in plain words. Marie nodded as if translating for the room. Thomas fetched his toolbox without being asked. "I've got a gasket sheet," he muttered. "We can cut one." They worked on the sidewalk, elbows knocking, tools passing from palm to palm like a ceremony with no single priest. In 40 minutes the pump coughed, then steadied into a purposeful thrum. The woman's shoulders fell a full inch. "How much?" she asked, already reaching for her wallet. "Pay me next week," Emily said. "Bring apricots when they're ripe. And come to the clinic Thursday, we'll talk about preventive checks." The woman laughed, partly at the kindness, partly at the audacity of calling a class clinic. "Apricots then," she said, and drove away with water in her future. Dusk gathered. Someone strung a temporary extension cord and clipped on a shop light that hummed like a friendly bee. The new sign wasn't painted yet, but Aunt Carol leaned a chalkboard against the door. Carter Mechanics and Learning, soft open. Beneath it, Miguel had written in hurried letters, "Tonight's topic, continuity." "Bring questions." Emily stood back, hands on her hips, allowing herself one unguarded smile. The space still smelled like a promise, raw and bright. She imagined the years it could hold, machines that would arrive broken and leave honest, teens who would become technicians, farmers who would pay less for the right fix because someone bothered to listen. She locked eyes with Thomas across the room. He lifted his pencil in a brief salute, an old bridge, acknowledging a new one erected on the same river. "All right," Emily called, voice steady and sure. "Let's set the first bench. Tomorrow we'll make it level. Tonight we'll make it ours." The sun rose behind the orchards, spilling amber light across Main Street. The brick building no longer looked abandoned. Its windows shone from careful scrubbing. The roll-up door stood freshly painted a deep green, and a hand-painted sign announced Carter Mechanics and Learning in bold white letters. Below it, smaller words read, Fix, Teach, Respect. Emily arrived on her motorcycle, toolbox strapped behind her as always. She parked, took a long breath, and let the engine's ticking cool into silence. Today wasn't about a single repair. It was about something larger, an opening, a promise, a root finally choosing its soil. Inside, the shop smelled of oil, soap, and faint chalk dust. The workbenches stood lined with tools arranged in neat rows. The pegboard bore jars of bolts and fuses Miguel had organized with boyish pride. A whiteboard waited clean and wide for diagrams that would come. It was far from perfect, cracks in the floor, wires that still needed proper channels, but it breathed possibility. One by one, the community trickled in. Bob and Linda arrived first, bringing a casserole in a dented pan. George Anderson followed, carrying a bundle of spare belts for the parts shelf. Marie came with her children and a tray of fresh cheese wrapped in cloth. Henry Lopez appeared, his little girl clutching his hand, whispering that she wanted to see the lady who fixed the noisy machine. Even Thomas Reed came, toolbox under his arm, nodding politely to each neighbor, as if to remind them he still belonged. Emily greeted them with a nervous smile. "This isn't a grand opening," she said. "It's just the first day." Aunt Carol, apron dusted with flour, clapped her hands. "First days are the only kind that matter." They gathered around as Emily lifted a small pump onto the bench. "I thought we'd start with something simple," she explained. Preventive maintenance. How to check a seal, how to listen for leaks, how to replace a gasket before the whole thing fails. She worked slowly, narrating each move. Miguel hovered close, eyes sharp, hands itching to help. When she handed him a wrench, his grin lit the room brighter than the overhead bulb. The others leaned in, asking questions, trading stories, sharing what they knew and what they had only guessed until now. Thomas stepped forward at one point, pointing at a worn connector. "Heat shrink here," he advised. "She's right, dust eats faster than fire." For the first time, Emily saw him not as competition, but as a teacher who had chosen a quieter role. She nodded, and he nodded back, a silent pact between generations. By midday, the shop was alive with voices and laughter. Someone brought a radio, its static softened by music that drifted between ranchera and classic rock. Children played near the doorway, while their parents leaned over the benches, learning with hands and ears. At the end of the session, Emily wiped her hands and turned to the group. Her heart beat fast, but her voice was steady. "I could have taken a job in a glass tower," she said. "A job with more money, more machines, more distance. But I realized that what matters isn't how many farms you touch on a chart. It's how many lives you help carry through a season. Here, I can fix machines. But more than that, I can pass on what I know. If we do this together, we'll leave less broken for the next hands that come." Silence held for a moment. Then the room erupted in applause. Not loud, but warm, the kind that stays. Bob stepped forward. "You saved my farm," he said simply, "and today you gave my son something better than a machine. You gave him a future." Miguel flushed but stood tall, still holding the wrench like a banner. George raised his voice. "Here's to the girl who proved the valley wrong." Emily shook her head. "Not wrong, just waiting to believe." As the afternoon faded into gold, people lingered outside, trading stories and promises. The casserole pan was empty, the cheese tray too. Someone had already pinned a calendar to the wall, marking the first clinic for next Thursday. The shop was no longer just hers. It belonged to them all. When the last family left and the door rolled shut, Emily sat on the stool by the workbench. The shop was quiet again, but not empty. Tools gleamed in their places. The smell of fresh oil mixed with tortillas from the casserole, Outside, the valley stretched wide and expectant, ready for another season. She thought of Michael Johnson's call, of the charts and numbers. Then she thought of Bob's voice, of Miguel's bright eyes, of Henry's relief. The decision no longer felt heavy. It felt right. Emily rose, locked the door, and swung onto her motorcycle. She rode slowly through town, the sun setting behind her, the road glowing like a ribbon of brass. Children waved, she waved back. At the edge of the valley, she stopped, cutting the engine. The fields whispered in the evening wind, rows of crops rustling like pages turning. She pulled off her helmet and let the sound settle deep inside her. "This is home," she whispered. She started the bike again, the engine's hum carrying her forward into night, not away, but deeper into the story she had chosen to write. And this was the story of Emily Carter, the young mechanic who proved that true success is measured not in money, but in lives transformed. Now, I'd love to hear from you. From where are you listening to this story? Write it in the comments. I'll be glad to know how far our stories are reaching. And if this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story we're preparing just for you.